The Senate voted. The cameras caught the tally. The headlines started moving. The score was on the board before the room had even cooled. To most people, that looks like the ending. A win, a loss, a clean political moment with a clear result. But in Washington, the vote is often the easiest part to see and the least important part to understand. Because history is not always changed by the number on the board. It is changed by what that number unlocks after the lights fade. Who gains room to move? Who gets boxed in? Who turns a procedural moment into real power? And that is why this story does not begin with what happened on the Senate floor. It begins with what happens next. On the surface, the vote looks simple. A tally appears. One side claims victory. The other side rushes to explain why the outcome was misunderstood, distorted, or incomplete. Reporters focus on the visible drama because visible drama is easy to package. Who crossed the aisle? Who looked stunned? Who smiled for the cameras? Who stood in front of microphones and declared that the Senate had spoken? But that surface can be deeply misleading, because a vote can pass and still leave the country in deeper uncertainty. It can fail and still hand one side a powerful political weapon. It can look decisive while settling almost nothing that matters. That is the part the public rarely gets in real time. The chamber records a result. Washington immediately begins rewriting what that result means, and the meaning is everything. Was this a real victory or just a temporary headline? Did one side actually gain leverage or just get a better soundbite? Did this vote create stability, or did it simply move the fight into a more dangerous room? Those are the questions that matter once the applause fades. And the vote may have settled less than people think, because what looked like an ending on the Senate floor may actually be the opening move in a much larger struggle over who gets to act next. This is where the story turns from theater into power. A Senate vote is never just a verdict on paper. It is a lever. It can open a door for the White House, shut one for Congress, strengthen a bureaucracy, weaken an opponent, or create political cover for something much larger than the vote itself. That is why the raw result matters less than the authority it appears to confer once everyone leaves the room. A passed measure can become a mandate. A failed measure can become a rallying cry. A narrow win can still expose weakness. A narrow loss can still create momentum. And in Washington, momentum is often more valuable than the headline, because the people who understand power best are not asking who celebrated tonight. They are asking who can now move faster, spend more, delay longer, pressure harder, or claim the right to act. That is the deeper fight hidden inside almost every major vote, not the speech. The opening, not the optics. The leverage. A bill, a nomination, a budget step, a war-related measure, an oversight vote, any of them can quietly rearrange the field after the public thinks the moment has ended. And once that happens, the real danger is no longer what the Senate just said. It is the machinery that answer may have just set in motion. Because the most important consequence of a vote is often not the decision itself. It is the new balance of power left behind. Now the vote begins doing what votes in Washington often do best, changing the rhythm of power without changing the public mood all at once. A result on the Senate floor can alter how aggressively the White House moves, how hard congressional leaders negotiate, and how much room federal agencies feel they have to act. That is where the story gets dangerous. Because public attention stays fixed on the tally while the machinery of government starts testing what the tally really allows. A president may treat the result as political permission. Congressional leaders may treat it as leverage for the next fight. Agencies may read it as a signal to move faster, write harder rules, release funds, delay enforcement, or prepare for a broader legal and political battle. And the side that looks weaker on camera can still become stronger in the trenches if it knows how to turn grievance into pressure. That is why the gap between public narrative and private strategy matters so much. In front of microphones, everyone says the same kinds of things. The people were heard, democracy worked, the other side lost. But behind closed doors, the question is colder. What can we extract from this? What can we accelerate? What can we block? What can we force the other side to defend? And once politics shifts into that register, the vote stops being a conclusion. It becomes a launch point. From here, the country may be heading toward calm paralysis or something much more explosive. The first path is de-escalation. On paper, it is the cleanest outcome. The vote gives both sides just enough to claim they defended their principles, protected their interest, or avoided something worse. Washington loves this kind of moment because it creates a brief illusion of order. Leaders step in front of cameras, call the process difficult but necessary, and try to turn a messy clash into a story about responsibility. Markets may breathe a little easier. Allies may hear a signal that the system is still capable of containing itself. But that does not mean the underlying fight is over. It only means the system has found a temporary place to stop bleeding in public. The pressure has not vanished. It has been managed, delayed, pushed behind language designed to make instability look like maturity. And that is what makes this kind of calm deceptive. A de-escalated outcome can still leave the same resentments in place, the same ambitions alive, the same structural conflict waiting for its next opening. In Washington, peace is often procedural before it is real. The temperature drops. The calculation remains. And when calculation remains calm, can be the most fragile stage of all. The second path is stalemate. And in many ways that may be more dangerous, because a Senate vote can end the scene without ending the fight. The tally is final. The conflict is not. One side says the result proves it has public backing. The other says the result proves the system is broken, manipulated, or too weak to settle anything that matters. And just like that, what looked like closure becomes a longer season of trench warfare. This is how Washington drifts from decision into paralysis. The vote does not produce clarity. It produces competing interpretations, each one weaponized for the next round. Leaders keep negotiating, but now from hardened positions. Committees keep investigating. Surrogates keep flooding television. The media keeps the story alive because unresolved power is easier to sell than resolved power. And all the while, the country is told that democracy is functioning even as more and more actual governing gets trapped inside delay messaging and revenge. That kind of deadlock is not loud in the way scandal is loud. It is slower, colder. It erodes confidence by making the public feel that even after all the speeches, all the votes, and all the drama, nothing truly gets settled. Budgets hang in limbo. Policy stays exposed. Markets begin reading dysfunction as risk. Allies start watching more carefully. But even paralysis is not the worst-case scenario, because sometimes a vote that resolves nothing becomes the perfect excuse for one side to push much harder. The third path is escalation, and this is where a Senate vote turns from a political event into a strategic weapon. One side takes the result not necessarily as a final answer, but as permission. Permission to move faster. Permission to frame the next step as justified, necessary, even inevitable. A narrow victory can be sold as momentum. A narrow defeat can be recast as proof that the other side must be confronted more aggressively. In Washington, almost any outcome can be turned into fuel by people determined enough to use it. That is what makes this stage so dangerous. The text of the vote may be limited. The interpretation of the vote is not. A result tied to spending can become the basis for a larger fiscal push. A result tied to war powers or national security can be used to justify tougher posture, broader authority, or more confrontational rhetoric. A result tied to personnel or oversight can trigger legal fights, media offensives, and a deeper contest over who controls the machinery of government. The vote does not need to say all of that explicitly. It only needs to create enough ambiguity for ambition to rush in. And once that happens, the center of the story moves. It is no longer about what senators just did under the lights. It is about who now has the initiative, who is forcing the next move, who is being dragged into a fight they did not want on these terms. And this is where the story stops being about the vote itself and starts becoming a battle over who sees the momentum after it. Now look at the players circling the result, because this is where the vote stops being a public event and becomes a private calculation. The White House is asking whether the outcome can be framed as legitimacy restraint or a green light. Congressional leaders are asking something else. How much leverage does this create for the next negotiation, the next hearing, the next funding fight, the next pressure campaign? Allies abroad are not studying the rhetoric alone. They are watching for consistency, durability, and whether the United States still looks capable of carrying through on what it says. The media has its own incentive. It wants a clean winner, a clean loser, and a clean narrative the audience can consume before the next cycle begins. But markets are colder than that. Markets do not care who delivered the sharper speech after the vote. They care whether this result reduces uncertainty, deepens it, or simply moves risk into another corridor of power. And that is why the same Senate tally can produce 5 different interpretations at once. Victory to one camp, warning to another, opportunity to a third, instability to a fourth, and to the public confusion. But inside that confusion, one fact matters most. Every faction is now trying to turn the same vote into its own weapon. And while they do, the part treated like background noise is the part that matters most in the end. The cost ordinary people may soon be asked to carry. And this is the part Washington almost never feels with full force in the room itself. The vote happens under bright lights beneath speeches about principal security, fiscal discipline, democracy. But ordinary Americans do not live inside Senate procedure. They live inside consequences. If this vote opens the door to more spending, they may feel it in deficits, borrowing inflation pressure, or the quiet squeeze of interest rates that stay painful longer than expected. If it deepens deadlock, they may feel it through delayed budgets, unstable programs, weaker confidence, and a government that looks increasingly unable to act without turning every fight into a cliff edge. If the vote touches war, foreign aid, defense posture, or executive power, the consequences can reach even farther. Through gas prices, through supply shocks, through market nerves, through the possibility that another confrontation abroad becomes another cost at home. And even when the impact is not immediate, the erosion can still be real. Trust weakens. Institutions look smaller. The public starts to feel that major decisions are not clarifying the future, only making it harder to read. That is why the real question is not what senators said after the roll call. It is what this outcome now puts in motion for taxpayers, consumers, families, workers, and voters. Because what happened on the Senate floor may matter less than the chain reaction it just set loose beyond it. So here is the real story. The Senate vote was never the whole event. It was the visible moment inside a much larger transfer of leverage. The board lit up, the cameras rolled, a winner was named, but power in Washington is rarely settled by the cleanest image. It is settled by who leaves the chamber with more room to act, more cover to pressure, and more ability to define the next move before the public even realizes the fight has changed shape. That is why what comes next matters more than what happened on the floor. A vote can calm the system, freeze it, or arm one side for a wider confrontation. It can reduce uncertainty for a week and deepen it for a year. It can look procedural and still reshape budgets, foreign policy, executive authority, market confidence, and the public's faith that anyone is really steering the country with a steady hand. In American politics, the vote is often the easiest thing to see. The consequence is the hardest thing to stop. And by the time the cameras leave, that consequence may already be moving. The deeper lesson is this. In Washington, the most important part of a political event is often the part that begins after the applause. People are trained to watch the tally. The speech, the headline, the instant verdict. But history is usually shaped in the quieter minutes that follow when institutions reposition strategies, hardened markets recalculate, and ordinary Americans are left to live inside whatever the new balance of power produces. That is why the question is never just what did the Senate vote to do. The more serious question is this: who now has the initiative, and what will that cost the country next? Because the part of politics that looks most official is often the least revealing. The part that follows is where the danger lives. If you're watching this, comment your location and local time, and subscribe if you want more coverage that goes past the vote, past the headline, and into what actually happens next.